What a pretty song. Part 2 of Ein Kelokenu by Eitan Katz from his album Unplugged 3, the songs of Shlomo Carlebach. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Tuesday evening? Shandor in the Bronx, Yehud in South Carolina, Renee in Indiana, Gwen in Michigan, John in Maine, Nancy in North Carolina, Belle in Florida, Tom in PA, Jack in Utah, wherever that is, says Jack. Bill in mid-Missouri, Paul in the Great Northwest, Tom in PA, loving the music, which we didn't have during the 9 days. Sharon can't stay with us right now, on her way to a Ziggy Marley concert. Enjoy. That sounds great. Melissa in Great Neck, Pauline in Chicagoland, Stephen in New Hampshire, Dan in Ohio, Lucy in Minnesota, Guy in Ohio, Melissa in Great Neck, Stacy in the Catskills. Welcome, everybody. And over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas. So, we are in a digression on a digression. Where are we holding? This is page 34 in Tractate Kesubos. We're in chapter 3, still discussing Mishna number 1. Generally, our tractate is about the law of marriage contracts, the ketubah. And one of the ideas of the ketubah, which was instituted to protect women in a very patriarchal time when only the man had the right by Torah law to divorce the wife, was that if he did divorce his wife, it would cost him. How much would it cost him? They could institute at the beginning of the marriage as much as they wanted, but the minimum would be 200 dinar for a virgin girl, or 100 dinar for a girl who'd been married before, a widow, divorcee, etc. So now that you've instituted that, a young lady who's a virgin is going to receive a bigger marriage contract than if she's not, well, what if, against her will, or through trickery, as it were, she had become not a virgin? And so here, chapter 3, we're talking about the law of a rapist or a seducer. And they went right to the more difficult aspect of that law. If it happened when the girl had entered puberty but was not quite an adult, partially under the authority of her father, and does the rapist pay the fine? Now, the punishment in the Torah is that the rapist owes a fine to her father, who needs to marry her off, and is forced to marry the girl and never is allowed to divorce her. Therefore, he supports her for the rest of her life. But what happens when the girl is somehow related to him or has a status like she's a mamzeret, where it's prohibited by Torah law to marry her? So now that the Torah said he marries her and pays the fine, but marriage is off the table, does he pay the fine? Yes, he does. And so now we got into a sort of related law digression about, well, when there's a fine and a different kind of punishment, do both apply? And so we've been discussing now for a couple days what happens when there's corporal punishment or capital punishment, that a person violates a prohibition that is going to result in lashes for violating a prohibition, or even capital punishment. He's subject to execution because he violated a serious law in the Torah at the same time that he damaged another person and owes them damages. So he becomes liable to a financial penalty at the same time as he becomes subject to lashes or the death penalty. Do we have both? And the general principle is, if he gets lashes and a financial penalty, he pays the financial penalty and he's not subject to the lashes. Or in the the more unusual circumstance where he is going to be flogged, then he's exempt from paying the monetary damages. But the sages are bringing all kinds of exceptions to that rule so that it's difficult to derive that principle. That is the principle, but there are exceptions, and there's problems in deriving the law, and we've been in an extended discussion on that. We didn't quite finish the page yesterday because we did 2 pages, but the case at the end of page 33 that we didn't study, just because we ran out of time yesterday, is the case of somebody who stole an ox and slaughtered it on Shabbos. Now, if you steal somebody's cow or goat in the Torah, you have to give it back. But if you slaughter it after you stole it, so now you can't give it back. But you're going to make restitution. Let's say you're atoning for your sin. You're not a godless sinner who doesn't care what the Torah says. You do care. You made a mistake and you want to make it right. So says the Torah, if you steal someone's animal and you slaughter it so that you can't give back the animal, so you have to pay money. How much money? This is an unusual thing, not just the value of the animal, but a very stiff penalty of 4 or 5 times the value of the animal. We're not going to get into the intricacies of that law. That'll come later in our journey. The point is that you have this big financial obligation toward the victim of your theft when you stole their animal and then you slaughtered the animal, presumably to eat it or sell it. Here's the thing. If you slaughter the animal on Shabbos, so now you desecrated Shabbos. And the penalty for desecrating Shabbos, when you are warned by witnesses or in the presence of witnesses that if you slaughter that animal on Shabbos, you are committing a death penalty offense, and then you do it anyway, right after the warning and in the presence of witnesses, so then you are subject to the death penalty. Well, if you're subject to the death penalty and to the financial payment, the 4 or 5 times the value of the animal, are you going to be liable to both? That would seem to violate our principle that it's never both. It's never both capital punishment and the fine, or lashes and the fine. But we saw there might be exceptions to that where, for example, when you stole it, is when you become liable to pay back the owner, and when you slaughtered it, that was later. So it didn't happen at the same time. So maybe you do pay and you're subject to the death penalty. Except that you don't really become liable to the 4 or 5 times penalty when you stole it. Maybe that was the beginning of your crime, but you could have given the animal back until you slaughtered it. When did you slaughter it? On Shabbos. So you became liable to the 4 or 5 times penalty at the same time as you became liable to the death penalty, assuming the warning, on Shabbos. So what happens in that situation? So says Rabbi Meir, you pay. I mean, it doesn't do the owner of the animal who lost the animal any good that you're being executed for desecrating Shabbos. You owe him the money and you pay. But the rabbis who overrule Rabbi Meir say, no, you're subject to the death penalty, and therefore you don't pay. The owner's out of luck, and you get executed because you stole the animal. Rabbi Yochanan explains this contradiction between the rabbi's ruling here and another ruling elsewhere as well. What actually happened, right? Or let's say explaining how Rabbi Meir and the rabbis could both be right. Rabbi Yochanan will say, well, what happened was, and the reason that he is going to pay, he's explaining, I guess, Rabbi Meir's opinion. The reason that he is going to pay is because when he stole the animal, he stole the animal. When it was slaughtered on Shabbos, he didn't personally slaughter the animal. He had a butcher do it, right? Not a kosher butcher who would never, perform this act of slaughter on Shabbos, but he found someone to do it, right? So somebody shechted, somebody slaughtered the animal on Shabbos. Now it's his agent, right? This agent did it on behalf of the thief, but you don't become liable for somebody else's crime in the same way. You could say they conspired, you can say that they were accomplices, but the bottom line is the one who slaughtered the ox on Shabbos is not the one who stole it. And that would be a way to reconcile Rabbi Meir's ruling and say, right, death penalty doesn't apply. You can't apply the death penalty to the guy who stole it. Therefore, the guy who stole it owes the money. All right, so here we pick it up. So the Gemara returns to Rabbi Yochanan's explanation of this baraisa, right, that the man's agent slaughtered it rather than himself. So if the baraisa is referring to the case of one who's slaughtered by means of another, he had an agent to do the slaughter, so then what is the rationale for the opinion of the rabbis who exempt him from payment? If Rabbi Yochanan was right that this is the explanation, but then the rabbi's ruling makes no sense. How could the rabbi say he's subject to the death penalty? He wouldn't be subject to the death penalty because his agent did it. And if his agent did it, and he's not subject to the death penalty, why would he not pay the man that he stole it from? So they're saying Rabbi Yochanan's explanation doesn't make sense. So as the thief did not perform a transgression for which he is liable to receive the death penalty, why is he exempt from payment for slaughtering the animal? And the Gemara answers, who are the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir? Right? Rabbi Meir says you pay. The rabbis say death penalty, and he's executed, and therefore he doesn't pay. Now we're at the top of 34a. So who are the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir? They are Rabbi Shimon, meaning they agree with Rabbi Shimon, but it's Rabbi Shimon's opinion. So it is Rabbi Shimon who said the legal status of slaughter that is improper in that it does not render the meat fit to be eaten is not that of slaughter, right? So slaughter is not the same as killing. Slaughter means kosher slaughter, right? It means that you killed an animal, a kosher animal, in a kosher manner for the purpose of eating it. But if you did that on Shabbos, well, then you didn't check the animal because it's not slaughter. Or if, for example, it was an animal that was used for idolatry, or you shechted it for the purpose of donating the meat to some idolatrous cause. So this is a fully illegal act, and we're not going to call that act of slaughter, right? So that's what Rabbi Shimon is saying. The legal status of slaughter that is illegal is not that of slaughter. Therefore, one is not liable for slaughter of the animal. And the Gemara asks, well, this works out well with regard to idolatry and the ox that is stoned, right? So idolatry means that you slaughtered it for the purpose of idolatry, or it was an animal that had been used in idolatry and now it can never be eaten or used by a Jew, and therefore it would be illegal to slaughter it and eat it. The ox that is stoned, this would be the habitual gorer, right? So an ox that sort of escapes from its pen, and it's a violent ox that hurts people. Okay, well, that's an accident, right? It was not foreseeable the first time. If it gets out of its pen a second time and hurts people, I think the law is even on the second time, it's still considered an accident, although you should really be careful. The third time, for sure, it was foreseeable that this is an ox that tends to escape from its pen and hurt people. So at that point, the owner of the ox becomes liable for any damage that the ox causes. And that is an ox that is not permitted to live because it's a hazard to society. And the ox that is stoned, this habitual gorer, is not an ox that you may eat. I think the ox that is stoned in this situation is where it already killed somebody, right? So if it killed somebody, then you can't eat the ox. I'm not sure if you can eat the habitual gorer or not. But at any rate, an ox that is subject to the death penalty, so it's probably because it killed somebody, that ox you cannot eat. So even if it's a kosher animal and you slaughter it in a kosher manner, because it hurt people or killed people, you can't eat that meat. And so its slaughter is not slaughter. However, the slaughter on Shabbos is a proper act of slaughter. Very interesting. It's absolutely forbidden to slaughter an animal on Shabbos. So how can you say that it is, legally speaking, an act of slaughter? This will be explained. As we learned in a Mishna in Tractate Chulin on page 14a. In the case of one who slaughters an animal on Shabbos or on Yom Kippur, although he is liable to receive the death penalty for desecrating Shabbos, his slaughter is valid and the meat may be eaten, right? For that situation, we don't throw away the meat. He could be subject to the death penalty for desecrating Shabbos or Yom Kippur, but if it was a kosher animal slaughtered in a kosher manner, somebody else can come along and eat the meat. So the Gemara answers, the Tan of the Baraisa under discussion holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar. As we learned in a Baraisa, and here's the whole Baraisa, and then we'll understand why it's relevant. With regard to one who cooks on Shabbos, illegal, if he did so unwittingly, he may eat the food that he cooked. If he did so intentionally, he may not eat the food. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says, if he cooked unwittingly on Shabbos, he may eat the food at the end of Shabbos, not during Shabbos, as the sages penalized even one who sinned unwittingly in that they are prohibited him from deriving immediate benefit from the dish that he cooked. And if he sinned intentionally, then he may not eat the food ever. Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler says, the most stringent opinion, if he cooked the meat on Shabbos unwittingly, the food may be eaten at the conclusion of Shabbos by other people, not by him. He's never going to be allowed to benefit from his act of cooking on Shabbos, which desecrates Shabbos, even if he did it accidentally. And if he did it intentionally, then the food may not be eaten ever, not by him and not by other Jews. So according to Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler, food prepared by means of intentional desecration of Shabbos is unfit to be eaten. And that is true with regard to cooking food on Shabbos and with regard to slaughtering an animal on Shabbos, right? So we see that there's a variety of opinions on this. According to some, even if you knowingly desecrated Shabbos when you slaughtered this stolen ox on Shabbos, the act of slaughter is meaningless because you can't, the slaughter on Shabbos, does not result in meat that could ever be eaten by anybody, and therefore it's not really slaughter. But that's only according to Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler. The other ones, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, say that if it was done intentionally, he can never eat it, but another Jew can. So even if he's subject to the death penalty, therefore the slaughter is slaughter. And so where are we? The slaughter is an act of slaughter. And so we're still asking, so he's going to be subject to the death penalty. Does he pay the fine to the one he stole the animal from? We're not clear yet. So the Gemara asks, what is the rationale for the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler, who says that slaughter on Shabbos is never slaughter, right? And so therefore, I guess maybe he's not subject to the death penalty. No, he is subject to the death penalty, but he didn't complete the crime of, right? That's what it is. He didn't complete the crime of stealing the ox and slaughtering it that would result in the financial penalty of paying 4 or 5 times. Why? Because even though the ox is dead, the thing that killed it was desecrating Shabbos in order to perform a slaughter. But since that slaughter on Shabbos, which was done intentionally, isn't legally slaughter, he didn't complete that crime, and that would result in the financial penalty, right? What is the rationale for the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler? The Gemara explains, it is as Rabbi Chia taught at the entrance to the house of the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin. And it is written, and you shall observe Shabbos, for it is sacred to you, and he who profanes it shall be put to death. Right? That's how we know that desecrating Shabbos intentionally with warning is a death penalty offense, Exodus 31:14. Now, just as with regard to a sacred item consecrated to the temple, eating it is prohibited, so too with regard to food produced through action that desecrates Shabbos, eating it is prohibited. Period. Doesn't matter any other circumstances. If this food came into being by desecrating Shabbos, it can never be eaten by anyone. That's Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler's opinion. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda disagree with him. Now the Gemara asks, if so, perhaps the analogy should be extended to include the following. Just as with regard to a sacred item, deriving benefit from it is prohibited, so too with regard to the product of an action that desecrates Shabbos, deriving benefit from it should be prohibited. The Gemara answers, the verse states, it is sacred to you, indicating that it shall be yours in the sense that one may derive benefit from it. So that would be Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara asks, based on the analogy between the actions that desecrate Shabbos and sacred items, one might have thought that even if the action was performed unwittingly, it should be prohibited to eat its product, like Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler states, as it is the case with regard to sacred items. Therefore, the verse states, he who profanes it shall be put to death, indicating that it is with regard to one who desecrates Shabbos intentionally that I stated to you that this analogy... Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler only says it can never be eaten by anyone at all if it was done intentionally. Unintentionally, he allows others to eat it after Shabbos ends, right? Now, the Gemara is saying now, you might have thought that even if it was unintentional, the fact that it desecrates Shabbos should render it off limits forever to everybody, but we don't hold that way. Nobody holds that way. Why? Because the verse says, he who profanes it shall be put to death. indicating that it is with regard to one who desecrates Shabbos intentionally that I stated to you this analogy to sacred items, as the verse is clearly referring to one who is liable to receive the death penalty, and not with regard to one who desecrates Shabbos unwittingly, because he is not executed. Now the Gemara comments, and remember, we're in a digression where we're figuring out why when a person receives both financial penalty and capital punishment, it's either one or the other and not both. But we're still working our way through this. So the Gemara comments, Rav Acha and Ravina disagree with regard to this matter. One said, the product of an action that desecrates Shabbos is prohibited by Torah law, and one said that it is prohibited by rabbinic law. Now, with regard to the one who said that it is prohibited by Torah law, it is, as we said, that it is based on the verse interpreted by Rabbi Chia. And the one who said that it is prohibited by rabbinic law holds that the verse states it is sacred, from which he infers it is sacred. But the product of its actions is not sacred, and therefore by Torah law, it may be eaten, right? They're drawing an analogy between something that is inappropriately slaughtered on Shabbos, therefore it cannot be eaten if it was done intentionally. And they're drawing an analogy to hekdesh, food that is consecrated for use of the temple. Once it's consecrated, it can only be used for temple purposes. And if somebody eats it himself, he has violated that. And they're saying there's a relationship between those two laws, but it's only the thing that is consecrated. But I guess, for example, if a chicken was consecrated, as teruma to be given to a priest, and then before the chicken was given to the priest, it had an egg. Does the egg belong to the priest, or does the egg belong to the owner? We're not really examining that case, but that might be the type of question that's being considered here. Right, it is sacred, but the product of its actions is not sacred, and therefore by Torah law it may be eaten. So the Gemara asks, and according to the one who said it is prohibited by rabbinic law, what is the rationale for the opinion of the rabbis who exempt the thief from payment for the slaughter performed by his agent on Shabbos, right? So this was one way to explain why somebody who you would think was liable to the death penalty for slaughtering on Shabbos, this ox that he stole, instead of giving him the death penalty, or even if he is going to get the death penalty, he's still going to be liable to pay the fine. And the explanation offered was, well, no, he's not subject to the death penalty because he himself didn't slaughter the animal. He had it slaughtered by another person. Therefore, he's not going to receive the death penalty, and he is liable to pay the person that he stole the ox from. And now that the ox has been slaughtered by his agent, he's liable to pay the owner, the original owner of the ox, the 4 or 5 times penalty. Right? So what is the rationale, the opinion of the rabbis who exempt the thief from payment for the slaughter performed by his agent on Shabbos? So they say, no, he doesn't pay. And it's because he gets the death penalty. But now they're saying, well, it seems like maybe the rabbis would say that he doesn't pay even though he doesn't get the death penalty because it was his agent who slaughtered it. Well, you would think he would have to pay. So they're asking, what is the rationale? And the answer is by Torah law. The challenge is by Torah law, the slaughter is valid. So the Gemara answers, when the rabbis exempt the thief from payment, it is with regard to the rest of the cases, i.e. one who slaughters for idolatry or an act sentenced to stoning, and not with regard to the case of Shabbos, right? In the case where his agent slaughters the stolen ox on Shabbos, even the rabbis would agree that the thief pays the one he stole it from. But so put the case of the ox slaughtered on Shabbos aside, and we're talking about the ox that was slaughtered for idolatry, or the ox that was slaughtered when it was an ox, fit to be stoned, or had already been sentenced to be stoned because it harmed people. That animal may not be eaten, and maybe it's in this case that the guy receives a death penalty and he's exempt from paying the money to the one he stole it from. So the Gemara asked the following question with regard to Rabbi Meir's opinion that one who slaughters for idolatry is liable to pay the owner for the animal. You would think that once he slaughters the animal for idolatry, he's subject to the death penalty, and therefore he's going to get the death penalty and not pay the owner of the animal. So says the Gemara, once he slaughtered the animal a little bit, We're going to break up the act of slaughter into a beginning, middle, end, it seems. Once he's slaughtered the animal a bit, at the very start of the act of slaughter, from then on it is prohibited for him to derive benefit from the animal because it is an animal sacrificed to idolatry. And when he finishes slaughtering it, it is not the animal that belongs to its owner that he is slaughtering. Right? Once the animal begins to be slaughtered, it's already being set aside for idolatry, and now no Jew can derive benefit from this animal. So even though the original owner lost the value of the animal, right? Once it was slaughtered for the purpose of idolatry, he can't receive benefit from that animal, even though the thief owes him a penalty of 4 or 5 times the value of the animal that was stolen. Once he slaughtered the animal a little bit, it becomes prohibited for anyone to derive benefit from it. And once he slaughters the rest, that animal, which is being slaughtered, isn't technically the property of the original owner anymore, because now it has become an animal for idolatry. Since it is prohibited to derive benefit from the animal, it has no value, and there is no ownership. So Rava said it is actually referring to one who says, prior to the slaughter, that he is worshiping the idol only at the completion of the slaughter, and therefore the prohibition takes effect only then. Okay, well then it seems like, simultaneously, the completion of the act of stealing and slaughtering was complete at the same moment as the ox was given to idolatry. So you would think the thief now gets the death penalty and the owner's out of luck regarding the payment. So the Gemara asks another question with regard to Rabbi Meir's opinion that one who slaughters the ox that is stoned, as opposed to the ox for idolatry, that he is liable to payment for the slaughter. Why is the thief liable? It is not the owner's ox that he is slaughtering, since once the ox is sentenced to be stoned, it is prohibited to derive benefit from it. And Rabbah said, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing here with a case where the original owner of the ox entrusted the ox to a Baal'i, and the ox injured another person while in the Baali's house, and it was sentenced to be stoned while in the Baali's house, and the thief that stole it from the Baali's house slaughtered it. The thief stole it from the Baali's house and slaughtered it. Now, when you entrust an animal to another person, there's a number of different relationships that could transpire here. One is that he borrows it from you for his benefit. He's going to be responsible for anything that happens to that animal. Another is you ask him as a favor to watch your animal for you. You're undertaking most of the risk of what could happen to that animal while your friend is watching it for you. Another situation is where you pay somebody to watch over your animal, right? Like a doggy hotel, you're paying him. So now he is getting paid, and therefore he undertakes the responsibility for whatever happens to your animal while he's watching it, because he's getting paid to do it. And the fourth situation is where he rents the animal from you. He's paying you so that he can use your animal to, plow his field or something. And then there's going to be a different set of rights and obligations and risk if something happens to the animal. So here's the case of the paid Baal'i. I pay you to watch my animal for me. You undertake most of the risk. And while you're watching my animal, the animal escapes and harms someone, and now becomes the ox that is set to be stoned. And so once it receives that sentence, that animal has no value. No one can benefit from it. But when I entrusted the animal to you, I had a perfectly good ox that was not sentenced to be stoned. So you would think that the Baal'i owes me an animal. And interestingly, if it becomes the ox set to be stoned while it's in his care, but he returns it to me, okay, so he gave me an ox back. Maybe now it's an ox set to be stoned and its value has been diminished to 0, but I gave him this ox and he gave it back to me. He's okay. But if the ox that's fit to be stoned gets stolen while it's in the Baal'i's possession, or actually gets executed while it's in the Baal'i's possession, now he owes me an ox, right? So that's the intricacies of that law we'll study at another time. Here, the point is they're going to add this total other wrinkle to the case so that we can understand why when the ox that was set to be stoned was stolen and then slaughtered, the thief might or might not have to make the penalty payment, even if he's subject to the death penalty for slaughtering an ox set to be stoned and trying to benefit from it. Or maybe he's not death penalty. Maybe it's not a death penalty issue at that point, but we're sort of multiplying circumstances and complexity here. Okay. So now we're saying it was the thief stole it from the Bailey's house and slaughtered it. And what is the value of this solution? This solution is based on the fact that Rabbi Meir holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yaakov, and he holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. What does this mean? He holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yaakov, who said, even after the ox was sentenced to be stoned, if the Bailey returned it to his owners, it is returned. Despite the fact that the ox is now worthless, as no benefit may be derived from it, since the Bailey returned an ox that is physically intact, the owner has no claim against the Bailey. And Rabbi Meir holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, who said that the legal status of an object that effects monetary loss is like that of money. So even in the case of an object that is worthless, because no one can derive benefit from the ox that is set to be stoned, so it's technically worthless. Even so, if the elimination of that ox causes monetary loss to the Bailey, because he has to give me an ox back. So if he doesn't have the ox that is set to be stoned in order to give it back to the original owner because it's been stolen, so now he has to replace that ox. It was his job to make sure it didn't get stolen. So now he owes me an ox, right? So even though it's a worthless ox, replacing it is going to cost the Bailey money. So even in the case of an object that is worthless, if the elimination causes monetary loss because it must be replaced, its elimination, it is considered to have value. And in this case, although the ox has no value in and of itself, slaughtering the animal prevents the Bailey from returning it intact to the owner, requiring him to pay the owner the value of the ox before it was sentenced to be stoned. And consequently, the thief must reimburse the Bailey, as the ox has value for the Bailey, even though the ox itself is worthless because it harmed a person and it's subject to be stoned. Rabbah said, actually, contrary to Rabbi Yochanan's explanation of the Baraisa, it is referring to one who slaughters the animal himself. So we're going back to Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation that the reason that the rabbi said, or that Rabbi Meir said, that the one who steals an ox and slaughters it on Shabbos, that they said he is subject to the death penalty and therefore he doesn't pay. Rabbi Meir says he pays, and Rabbi Yochanan explained the reason that he pays is because he didn't actually slaughter the animal himself, his agent did. Rabbah is going to disagree with that explanation. He says, contrary to Rabbi Yochanan's explanation of the Baraisa, it is referring to one who slaughters the animal himself. Now we're on 34b. And Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that one is flogged and pays. Okay, so if you're sentenced to lashes for an action that resulted in both lashes and a financial penalty, says Rabbi Meir, both. You get whipped and you pay the money. But Rabbi Meir is not of the opinion that one who dies by execution also pays. So according to Rabbah, Rabbi Meir would say, if you're subject to lashes and payment, you do both. If you're subject to death penalty and payment, you only do the death penalty, and they're going to enforce the death penalty, then you don't pay. And these laws are different. Why? Because it is a novel element that the Torah innovated with regard to the legal category of fines. Although he is killed, he pays. And Rabbah followed his line of reasoning stated elsewhere. As Rabbah said, if one had a stolen kid in his possession that he had stolen previously, and he slaughtered it on Shabbos, he is liable to pay 5 times the principal for slaughtering the kid. Why? Because he was already liable for stealing before he came to violate the prohibition against performing labor on Shabbos. Although he slaughtered the goat on Shabbos, which is a capital crime if he was warned, he is liable for the payment as well because it is a fine, right? So here we're distinguishing between damages, right, I stole your animal, you're out one animal, I owe you the value of the animal. But the Torah said, I have to pay you 4 or 5 times the value of the animal. When is it 4 times? When is it 5 times? Not relevant right now. But the idea of multiplying the value of the animal to punish me for stealing and slaughtering it, that's a fine, right? That is a legal penalty beyond the damages incurred by the owner. And because the Torah has innovated this concept of fine, says Rabbi Meir, we're not going to put that aside like we would put aside damages. A fine is different than damages. They're both financial payments, but damages are damages. And when you're subject to death penalty and damages, okay, death penalty, no damages. But if you're subject to death penalty and a fine, so maybe you have to pay both. You get the death penalty and you pay the fine, since a fine is a unique category in the Torah. However, if he stole the goat and slaughtered on Shabbos, he is exempt from the payment of the 5 times principle, as if there is no payment for theft due to his liability to receive the death penalty for desecrating Shabbos, and his obligation to repay the theft is not a fine, there is no liability for slaughter, and there is no liability for sale, right? So just replacing what you stole is different than paying the fine. And Rabbah said, if one had a stolen kid in his possession that he had stolen previously, and he slaughtered it in the course of an act of burglary, he is liable to pay 4 or 5 times the principal, as he was already liable for theft because he came to violate the prohibition against burglary. However, if he stole and slaughtered an animal in the course of the same act of burglary, he is exempt. Because the owner of the house is permitted to kill the burglar, the status of the burglar is tantamount to one liable to receive the death penalty. As if there is no payment for theft, there is no liability for slaughter, and there is no liability for sale. Rabbah's statements, it's confusing, but hold on. Rabbah's statements indicate that one pays the fines for slaughter or sale, even if he is liable to receive the death penalty. And he's learning that out from the case of burglary. Interesting. One, in California, if somebody breaks into your house, you're not allowed to kill him. You can only kill the intruder if the intruder presents an imminent threat to life once he's in your house. The fact that he entered your house is not proof that he was, willing to kill you and that therefore you're allowed to kill him. In Texas, I think they have the castle law, right? Where if somebody's breaking into your house, that's evidence enough that he poses a threat to life and limb, and then you can kill him. The Torah is somewhere in between those points of view. And it says that one, and again, we're not going to examine this area of law. We're going to get to it in much more nuance later in our journey through the Talmud. But if one is coming into your house, and right now I'm spacing, I can't remember if there's a difference between daytime or nighttime when he's doing it. Even though he's not holding a weapon to your head, the fact that he's coming into your house is evidence that he's willing to kill you. And under those circumstances, right, it's particular. It's not any time he breaks into your house, but when he breaks into your house such that, even though he's not holding a weapon, the circumstances are, fulfilled. The elements of the crime of burglary are fulfilled, that he's sort of tunneling in, and he would be willing to kill you, then you are allowed to kill him. Legally speaking, for the purposes of the law we're talking about here, once he's in your house and subject to the homeowner being allowed to kill him, it's like he's liable to the death penalty. And even though he wasn't warned, right, by witnesses that if you do this, you could be killed, once he's in your house, since the homeowner is allowed to kill him as an act of self-defense, it's like the burglar is subject to the death penalty. And now they're asking up for the purposes of today's discussion. So he's somebody who's subject to the death penalty while he's in your house. And he steals something. Is he also liable to pay for what he stole? So the Gemara comments, and it was necessary for Rabbah to state this law with regard to both Shabbos and burglary, as if he had taught us that one is exempt from payment only with regard to Shabbos, when he stole something and then slaughtered it on Shabbos, thereby desecrating Shabbos, earning a death penalty. And is he liable to pay or isn't he? So if one is exempt from payment because, right, you're not going to have to pay the penalty while you're subject to the death penalty for desecrating Shabbos, it might be only because Shabbos is severe, since punishment for violation of its prohibition is an eternal prohibition. As whenever witnesses testify that one desecrated Shabbos and he was warned, he can be executed. However, in the case of burglary, punishment for violating its prohibition is transitory. You're only subject to the death penalty for burglary while you're in the homeowner's house at a certain, time and situation where he is entitled to kill you as an act of self-defense. So there you're technically liable to the death penalty, but once you leave the house, you're not. You're not liable to the death penalty because you broke and entered and left. You're only liable to the death penalty while you're in there if the homeowner kills you. So therefore, you would say that the law of desecrating Shabbos is more stringent than the law of burglary. And if he taught us the exemption with regard to burglary, that would be because burglary is his forewarning. You would say, well, actually, burglary is more stringent in that the homeowner doesn't have to warn the burglar. Once the burglar is in the house under the conditions that justify shooting, the homeowner just shoots him and doesn't have to warn. But for Shabbos death penalty to take effect, the desecrator must be warned. So since these two areas of law, one is more stringent in one situation, the other is more stringent in a different way. Therefore, you needed both cases in order to understand this idea of one who is subject to the death penalty doesn't pay the fine. So Rav Papa said, if one had a stolen cow in his possession that he had stolen previously, right? So he already stole it. Now he owns it in the sense that he took it and now it's in his property and he's acquired it. And then not on the same day that he stole it or at the same time that he stole it, but some days later comes Shabbos and he slaughters the cow on Shabbos. So it's like two separate crimes separated by time. Then what? Says Rav Papa, he is liable to pay 4 or 5 times the principal, as he was already liable for theft before he came to violate the prohibition of Shabbos. If a cow was lent to him, right, he borrowed the cow and he slaughtered it on Shabbos, he is exempt from paying the fine, right, because he became liable for essentially stealing somebody else's cow. He borrowed it, but then he slaughtered it. So at that point, he misappropriated it and slaughtered it, so it can't be given back. So he becomes liable to the 4 or 5 times penalty, but he did that. He became liable at the same moment that he slaughtered it on Shabbos. So he's subject to the death penalty, exempt from the fine. Whereas if he had already stolen it, he became liable to pay the fine earlier than he became liable for desecrating, to the death penalty for desecrating Shabbos. Rav Ashi said to him, Rav Papa is coming to teach us the law with regard to a borrowed cow. As it could enter your mind to say that since Rav Papa said it is from the moment of pulling the animal into his domain that the borrower is obligated to provide the animal's sustenance, then here too, from the moment of borrowing, he is liable to pay for its unavoidable accidents because he borrowed it. From that point, the animal is legally in his possession, and therefore, even if he slaughtered the animal on Shabbos, he should be liable, right? Even though he borrowed it, maybe not intending at that moment to slaughter it on Shabbos, but then he did slaughter it on Shabbos. Okay, but the act with respect to the original owner of the cow began when he borrowed it. So he should have to pay the fine, which began when he borrowed it, even though he became liable to the death penalty when he slaughtered it on Shabbos. And so from that point, the animal is legal in his position, and therefore, even if he slaughtered the animal on Shabbos, he should be liable. You might think, therefore, Rav Papa teaches us that one assumes liability for unavoidable accidents only when they actually occur. And if that is on Shabbos, he is exempt. So we don't retroactively say that you became liable to the penalty of 4 or 5 times the value of the animal when you borrowed it on Wednesday if you slaughtered it on Shabbos. No. Then you only borrowed it, and the act that resulted in the 4 or 5 times payment penalty only happened on Shabbos when you slaughtered it on Shabbos, but you also incurred the death penalty when you did that. So you're subject to the death penalty and not to the payment. Rava said, if their father died and left them a borrowed cow, they may use it for the entire duration of the period for which it was borrowed. The right to use a borrowed article continues even after the borrower himself dies. However, if the cow died, they are not liable to pay for its unavoidable accident, as they did not borrow the animal themselves. And similarly, if they thought the cow belonged to their fathers and they slaughtered it and ate it, and then they learned that it was borrowed, they pay only a reduced assessment of the price of the meat. They are not ones who borrowed the cow and then decided to slaughter it, which would trigger the 4 or 5 times payment. Their father borrowed it, and they didn't know that when they killed it, so they do owe the owner the value of the meat, but they don't pay the multiplied penalty. However, if their father left them property as a guarantee for return of the borrowed item, i.e. there was a lien on the father's property during his lifetime, then they are obligated to pay the entire sum of the damage. And the Gemara comments, some teach this statement, that if the father left property as a guarantee, his heirs are liable to pay the entire damage with regard to the first clause of this law, and some teach it with regard to the second clause. And the Gemara explains, according to the one who teaches it with regard to the first clause, when the animal died, all the more so would he teach the law with regard to the latter clause, as they are slaughtering the animal, they must pay full damages. And this approach differs from the opinion of Rav Papa, who said that a borrower is liable for accidents only when the incident occurs. And according to the one who teaches it with regard to the latter clause, this law applies only when they slaughtered and ate it. However, with regard to the first clause, when it died, they would not be liable, as the rabbi of this teaching also maintains that liability for unavoidable accidents begins only when the incident occurs and not from the moment that the cow was borrowed. And this is consistent with the ruling of Rav Papa. I'm almost done. If you have questions or comments, please get them in. Several possible solutions were proposed to resolve the apparent contradiction between the Mishnah here. Now we're back to the subject that this chapter is about. Several possible solutions were proposed to resolve the apparent contradiction between the Mishnah here, that says that one who rapes his sister pays a fine, and the Mishnah in Tractate Makos that says he is whipped, right? We're back to, well, if you're whipped, you don't pay the fine. And if you pay the fine, you are not whipped. And in the case of one who rapes his sister, which is it? You pay the fine, says this Mishnah, or you get whipped, says the Mishnah in Tractate Makos, which is about floggings. So the Gemara comments, granted, Rabbi Yochanan, who explains the Mishnah as referring to a case where he was not forewarned, right? If he was not forewarned that raping his sister will result in lashes, so then he cannot receive lashes and therefore he pays the fine. But if he was warned that raping his sister would result in him getting whipped, then he gets whipped. That's how Rabbi Yochanan explained the contradiction between these two Mishnahs. So granted, Rabbi Yochanan, who explains the Mishnah as referring to a case where he was not forewarned, did not state his opinion in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish. Okay, what did Reish Lakish say? Reish Lakish explains that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, as he establishes the Mishnah in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, a preferable option, as that aligns the unattributed Mishnah with the law. However, what is the reason that Reish Lakish didn't state his opinion in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan? The Gemara answers, Reish Lakish could have said to you, since if they forewarned him, he is exempt from payment. When they did not forewarn him, he is exempt as well, because you should have one law. And Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish each follow their standard lines of reasoning in this regard. As when Rav Dimi came from the land of Israel to Babylonia, he said, with regard to those who unwittingly perform the transgression for which one is liable to receive the death penalty, or those who unwittingly perform the transgression for which one is liable to receive lashes, and the transgression also involved another matter like monetary payment, Rabbi Yochanan said he is liable to pay. Since he sinned unwittingly, he did not receive the severe punishment, so the lashes or the death penalty is off the table, so let him pay the fine. And Reish Lakish said he is exempt. And the Gemara clarifies the rationales. Rabbi Yochanan said he is liable since they did not forewarn him. He sinned unwittingly, no lashes, so then he pays. And Reish Lakish said he is exempt since if they forewarned him, he is exempt from payment. Then therefore when they did not forewarn him, he is exempt as well. I guess the rationale being that Reish Lakish doesn't want whether the person was warned or not to determine whether he is liable to damages or not. That's where we knock off today. Tomorrow we continue with page 35 here in Tractate Kesubos. Let's see if we can handle any questions on page 34. This is not easy stuff. If you're a little confused, normal. If you're following it, yasher koach. May you be strengthened to continue growing your Talmudic brain. David Kozlowski, if you steal livestock to feed your family, you owe 5 times its value. Right, we haven't said anything about the motivation of the thief. Now you might say he stole because if he didn't steal, he and his family would starve. Okay, but that doesn't mean that he's off the hook with regard to the owner. And I believe you're right, if he stole and slaughtered, he owes a penalty of 4 or 5 times. And perhaps the Torah is saying, listen, your family's hungry. What we want you to do is go to the leaders of the community and say, I'm starving, and now they're obligated to feed you, rather than to take the matter into your own hands and become a thief. We don't want you to become a thief, even in that extreme situation, if there's any alternative. Bill, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action. Ian Fleming, I guess, from James Bond, but very good in terms of the law of the habitually goring ox. Tom, but is sacrificing an animal for idolatry slaughter? Great question. What are you doing, right? One idea might be that you're going to make a feast in honor of some pagan deity, and so you're going to do a kosher slaughter of a kosher animal, but for the purpose of eating it at an idolatrous feast. So maybe that's slaughtering for idolatry. Maybe you're doing it in the presence of the idol and, making some kind of incantation that you're donating it to the idol, or you're going to donate it to the priests of idolatry, something like that. And I think also, it's not mentioned here, but if memory serves, if that animal had already been consecrated to idolatry, then even though technically it's a kosher animal and a kosher slaughter, you can never benefit from that animal. Louis Gombach, final question. If an ox that is set to be stoned is stolen and slaughtered, its death will be less painful. Is that discussed anywhere? Is the purpose of stoning the ox something other than public safety? No, I think the purpose of stoning the ox is public safety. And what's interesting is why is it that you cannot benefit from that animal? Right? You would think, well, maybe you could even say the owner should not benefit because his animal hurt someone else. But why not give the meat of that animal to the victim's family? You'd think it'd be a little less wasteful. But, it just seems like there is, this is a law from God. And so we don't necessarily have to understand it. But we could speculate that God is saying, listen, that which was used to kill human beings, we should not benefit from. Right? And so I like what you're saying, Luis, that its death will be less painful. I mean, I think even in American culture, an animal that kills a human is put down, right? And that's it. Nobody benefits from it. If, for example, a lion escapes from the zoo and kills somebody, that animal's going to be killed. A bear that does that is going to be killed. And I think it would be in very poor taste to make a rug out of the pelt of the lion or the bear that killed somebody and put it in your house. Probably not illegal, but I think under Torah law, it would be. I think. So that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 35. Have a great night.